Thank you so much for coming to Abundant Living Neurofeedback and Counseling. We are so grateful that you're here. We're so thankful that you've chosen us on your journey to health and healing. We believe that neurofeedback is the best kept secret in mental health, and we believe that we employ neurofeedback better than anyone else. We are dedicated to healing. We are dedicated to quality control, and we are dedicated to our clients. We want to see each person recover and have the fullest, most abundant life possible. In this video, you're going to be able to see the technical part of neurofeedback. You're going to see and understand how it works. You're going to have a good technical understanding of what it is from a scientific and psychological perspective, and you're going to be able to understand what you should expect out of the process, what the process looks like, what is the EEG, what does neurofeedback look like, and finally, what can you look forward to in terms of how and when you graduate from therapy. Neurofeedback has a lot of terminology that individuals are not accustomed to hearing. So one of the things that I often say is measuring or training, consolidation or acquisition. So let me explain. What that means when we are measuring, what that means is we are actually picking up the electrical signals from your cortex. So whether it be in an EEG or whether you're in a neurofeedback training session, you're going to be hooked up with leads and electrodes that are pulling the electricity from your scalp and measuring it through the database that we have. So that when I say measuring, we're talking about actual measuring electrical activity that's coming from your brain. When we talk about training, we're talking about the actual neurofeedback session. In that session where you're hooked up with leads, the computer is measuring and analyzing your activity in real time, and you're receiving the biofeedback training from the screen. When I talk about consolidation, what I mean is the brain's ability to memorize what we've been doing. It becomes the new normal. So consolidation is what we're going for. That's our end goal. In the training phase, however, we have what we call acquisition. The acquisition phase is where your brain is figuring out what it needs to do to normalize. It's figuring out how it needs to respond to the biofeedback in a way that is producing normalized activity. So just like riding a bike, when you are training, your brain is getting feedback cues, and what it knows is it wants to stay upright. So it's acquiring the ability to stay upright. It's acquiring the ability to figure out how to stay upright on the bicycle and not fall over. The consolidation phase of riding a bicycle is when you're on. Every time you get on, you're not wobbling, you're going forward, and you are absolutely certain that you're going to be able to go where you want to go and get there safely and effectively. Something we talk about a lot in neurofeedback is neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change. And neurofeedback enables the brain to create an unbelievable amount of neuroplasticity, far beyond what it would be able to do on its own. So as we're creating that change in the brain, we are, one, unlocking the stuck patterns that have kept the brain in a sometimes very painful state, and two, we're able to introduce normalization. So while the brain is creating this neuroplasticity and change, inside of that change, we're also producing an overwhelming amount of normalization that's going to lead to reduction in symptomology and create more peace of mind and more harmony in the way the brain is functioning. The process we use to quantify electrical activity and to address the issues that are actually going on in each individual client's brain is through the QEEG. The QEEG is our way of measuring the entire spectrum of electrical activity in the individual's brain. It enables us to see exactly what's going on with each individual and then create what we call a brain map. So when you're doing the EEG, you're wearing an electrode cap. It's full of electrodes. We insert gel into the cap, and that gel actually, it's a conductive gel that pulls the electrical activity from the scalp through the electrodes and then into the computer. So the computer can analyze that information and compare it to the normative database and create a highly detailed brain map so that we have an incredible look, a very specific look at what your brain is doing that's causing you pain and suffering. One of the tools we have in neurofeedback is access to what we call the normative database. The normative database is a collection of hundreds of individuals who have brain maps that are asymptomatic. We are able to see what a brain looks like and how it's functioning without the symptoms of anxiety, depression, or PTSD. So we're constantly comparing your brain, whether it be in the EEG, where we're creating a brain map, or in the neurofeedback session where we're measuring and training your brain against the normative database. With neurofeedback, your brain is actually being read in real time and compared in real time to that normative database with over 300 different variables and being given feedback based on that normative database so that your brain can align with what we know is normal and optimal. The process of neurofeedback starts with the QEEG. The QEEG is where we measure exactly what's going on in the cortex of your brain. From that, we are able to see through our brain map the areas of the brain that are regulated, the areas of the brain that are dysregulated, and how that's contributing or causing your symptoms. After we've done the brain map, then we come to the table and we do the review of findings. You'll be sitting down with me personally. I'll be going over the brain map with you. This is a highly individualized process where I will be sitting down with you and showing you exactly what's going on in your brain and exactly what is holding up the issues that are causing you pain or frustration. This part is actually very therapeutic and it's exciting because it's like unveiling the invisible giant. You'll be able to look at your brain and see that it's not just all in your head, it is actually all in your brain. And I'll be able to share with you how that information relates to you, how it's affected you, and we're going to help you understand very specifically what neurofeedback is going to do in order to regulate those areas so that you can feel like you're living in a brain where you're definitely in the driver's seat, feeling like you are in charge of your thoughts, your feelings, and emotions, and being able to decide how you want to think and how you want to feel and how you want to react in any given situation. After we've gone over your brain map together, you are going to feel extremely validated. Validation is one of the greatest gifts that I believe comes from reviewing a brain map together because you can actually see what's going on in your brain and how it's been contributing to your symptoms. So after we go over the brain map together, I will be analyzing your brain map and I will be looking at the placements we're going to choose that I believe are going to be giving you the most effective, most efficient results possible. Neurofeedback is an art and a science. So throughout the process, we are going to be doing what we call the progress tracker. Every other session will have you sit down, we'll have you rate your issues on a scale of 1 to 10. And we also have a series of questions that will have you answer for us. All of that information is highly regarded in terms of we need to know how you're doing. We want you to be the scientist at home, bring those findings to us so that we can be the very best scientist we can be for you. So as we're measuring your progress and we're looking at the trajectory of how you're scoring yourself and making sure that you're improving in all of the areas that we're working in, we may fine-tune along the way a location or two that we feel like is going to bring a better push to bring you faster relief. Each time when you come to Abundant Living, you are going to be greeted by our incredible staff. I am so proud of the staff that we have. Every person here is here because they want to see people heal. One of your favorite parts of your experience here will inevitably be the relationships that you're going to form with the technicians that we have. They are incredible. Their heart and mind is to make sure that you are getting the care, the quality care that you deserve, and making sure that you are getting the progress that we want you to have. I let our clients know that I have an open door policy. I'm not going to be the one you'll be seeing in the rooms. In our treatment rooms, you'll be seeing our incredible staff. However, At any time in the process, if you need to reach out to me or talk to me, I will be readily available. You can let our staff know, or you can let us know that you would like to speak with me, and I will be in touch with you very quickly. It is extremely important that you feel connected to the process, that you feel that I'm connected to you in terms of being able to make sure we are getting you the progress that you need to have in the time that we feel you should be getting it. We don't let anyone fall through the cracks. We want your communication. Your communication is vital, and your communication is important to us, because without your communication, we don't know how you're doing from week to week. We want to measure your progress as effectively as possible so that we can make sure if there's any fine-tuning we need to do on our part, that gets done for you so that you can get the very best possible care. When we begin your treatment, we will begin with your baseline brain map. We will also begin with your baseline assessments of yourself. So what we do is we do packages of 20 sessions of neurofeedback, where at the end of that package we will do another assessment. We'll begin with your initial EEG, your initial personal assessments that you'll do online, and we'll do all of that again at 20 sessions. Now, it's very important to note that 20 sessions is not time to graduate. 20 sessions is not enough time to get what we call consolidation or permanence of change. However, we do expect you to be feeling improvements within even a few sessions, 5 to 6 sessions at the very most. We're looking for you to be giving us feedback on changes that you're seeing. They'll be subtle, but they should also be certain. At the 20-session brain map review, we will be looking for what's improved. You'll have lots of improvements at 20 sessions. We're also looking for what's still outstanding. Let's say you come in with 4 or 5 different symptoms. We're going to be training all of those symptoms simultaneously. I don't have to pick and choose between attention issues or processing issues or anxiety or depression. Because of the technology that we have, I can work on all of those things together. So at the 20-session brain map review, I'm looking to see at how all of those things have improved together, and if there's anything that I can do based on your map and based on your feedback to fine-tune that process so that we can hone in even more definitely on any symptoms that are still outstanding. At 20 sessions, we always plan on going forward to the 40-session mark. 40 sessions is where we can depend on what I call consolidation or permanence. That's where your brain has had enough time to not only learn and practice and rehearse these new patterns in training and in treatment, but your brain has had enough time to actually bring those patterns in and make it part of its new normal. As I'm explaining the different signature patterns of attention disorder, anxiety, or depression, I want people to understand I'm giving examples that are common examples. For most, there are several different signatures of the brain that hold up these different disorders, but I like to give common examples so that you can understand how brainwave activity actually relates to disorders and how training the brain to normalize that brainwave activity is going to help people get relief from the disorders for which they're seeking help. In the brain, there are 5 major types of brainwave activity that we are measuring and training for: delta, theta, alpha, beta, and high beta. All 5 different forms of activity should be functioning at a certain level at any given point in time. During the waking state, with your eyes open, they all should actually be in a certain ratio to each other. So it's very much like a harmonic chord on a piano. Each of those notes being a certain distance from each other, they have this beautiful resonance. I like to tell people that the brain operates very much the same way electrically. Brain waves seem to resonate together when they're at an optimal ratio to each other. So when you're in training, we are actually training your brain to produce the optimal amount of each type of activity. And we're also training the brain to create the optimal amount of connectivity and communication between each of the locations that we're training. It's important to note that even though we're training using 4 locations, the entire brain is resonating with normalization, so that even though we may be training from 4 different locations of the brain, we're in no means able to isolate those locations because the brain is an interconnected universe. What we're doing when we're training those 4 locations, we're not just training those 4 locations, but we're training the entire brain to resonate with the optimal amount of each type of brainwave activity so that it's resonating, so that the processing is fluid, so that one part is not producing too much and the other part is not producing too little. For example, in the executive function in the frontal lobe, we want that part of the brain to be engaged, focused. We don't want there to be too much slow wave activity that causes a slowing in the traffic, and we also want there to be an optimal amount of the fast beta processing so that we can think clearly, focus, and have appropriate amounts of motivation and attention. A great example of where we want our brain to be balanced and in harmony is in our executive function. This is in the frontal lobe. This is the front part of our brain, the frontal lobe and the prefrontal cortex. In those parts of the brain, we want to make sure that there's not too much slow wave activity, and we want to make sure that there's enough fast processing speeds. So for instance, with attention disorders, many times there's way too much slow wave activity, way too much delta and theta activity that's causing what we call a traffic jam, and possibly not enough of the faster speeds that actually cause and create the proper processing. So when we get a traffic jam in the frontal lobe, the executive processing is going to suffer. Attention, focus, motivation, impulsivity, those things are not going to be governed the way that they should be governed. Our goal in neurofeedback is to balance those types of activity so each is operating at its optimal state so that the brain can focus and attend the way that we want it to be able to focus and attend, and then it's not interrupted or bogged down by unnecessary heavy and slow brainwave activity. It's very important in the frontal lobe, in order to have the type of clarity and focus that we want to have, is that we have an optimal amount of the faster beta processing speeds. Those are the faster speeds that get communication from point A to point B. And we want that communication to be able to get through fluidly and clearly without the interruption of too many heavy, slow waves. So that faster beta processing, that's the fast processing speed that's getting the communication through, that's getting the attention through, that's gating impulsivity, that has so many important functions for the executive process to work properly. So when we are helping someone with attention disorders, largely in many cases we're working primarily in the frontal lobe in order to get all the different types of activity balanced and functioning so that the focus, the motivation, and the attention and the clarity are uninterrupted and optimized. One of the things that it's really important for me to help people who are suffering from panic attacks or PTSD to understand is that their brain has actually gotten stuck in a state of high alert. They feel that, they know that, but they don't know why. Because they can tell themselves that everything's fine and everything's calm, but they keep getting the signals that everything's not okay. So what we're able to do with neurofeedback is we're able to create neuroplasticity. We're able to create change in the brain that ordinarily wouldn't spontaneously change. Because the brain is an adaptive organ, it's also a repetitive organ. Once it gets into a state, it tends to keep rehearsing that state. PTSD is probably the easiest example that I have of how the brain can get stuck in an unnecessary state. During a trauma, the brain is on high alert, it's hyper-focused and hyper-vigilant. It's also a memory machine. But that becomes very painful after the trauma has passed and the individual is still experiencing their brain as though they're still inside the trauma. So what we can do with neurofeedback is we're able to go to those places in the brain that are producing that excessive activity and actually train them to calm down. So the person is no longer getting the signals that everything is high alert. The person is no longer getting the signals that they need to be hypervigilant, but they're actually getting the signals that let them be okay with a calm, steady state of being without the fear and the panic and the anxiety of trauma. One of the amazing things that I get to do is help people understand why they're suffering. Depression is one of the most common issues that brings individuals in for help. Depression, anxiety, and attention disorders. What a lot of people don't realize is that depression is often the end result of long-term anxiety. Many people have coexisting anxiety and depression. One of the primary ways that depression presents on a brain map is that the brain begins to produce excessive amounts of alpha activity. Well, alpha activity is the activity of calm and relaxation in the brain, but more doesn't necessarily feel better. More may be needed in terms of the brain being able to slow itself down as a protective mechanism, because the brain can't just be in a chronic state of anxiety over a long period of time without the brain having to employ a mechanism to slow things down for its own survival. However, in doing this, the individual can become depressed. Excessive alpha activity in the brain causes a person to feel depressed because that excessive slowing is literally slowing everything down. So what I call that is kind of a wet blanket feeling. You can see it on paper, you can see the excessive amounts of alpha activity, and I can explain to people how it feels. Everything begins to feel harder and everything tends to feel more negative. So depression is a spectrum. I tell people depression is usually not Hollywood depression. We know what Hollywood depression looks like in terms of the crying and the sleeping too much, or the hopelessness, or God forbid, even suicidal ideation. But what we don't talk about so much is the spectrum of anxiety. What happens before we get to that very, very low point of hopelessness? The spectrum of anxiety starts with negativity. So over here, we're optimistic, we're hopeful, we are able to see things with gratitude, and we're able to see things with the sun shining. But as we move over into this place, the brain moves over into a more and more negative and heavy space where we're no longer able to interpret things so positively. We might begin to interpret things more and more negatively. We're looking more and more through a negative filter so that things become more heavy. Oftentimes individuals will begin to experience anger and irritability way before they experience signs of depression. But that anger and irritability can be a sign that that's the direction that their brain is headed. So I really like to help people understand some of these symptoms that they have no idea are even related to a depressed state. I love to help people understand how that's related to the pathway to depression and what that actually looks like in the brain. My passion is to help individuals understand why they're suffering. My passion is to help unveil the invisible giant of suffering that shows up on paper in a brain map in very predictable ways. I want people to understand that there's a reason that they feel the way that they feel. It's not all in their head, but it is all in their brain. So what I want to do is help people understand, for instance, with issues like anxiety, PTSD, or depression, that there's a real pattern of activity that's holding up the propensity of their brain to stay in that state, that there's something physically happening in their brain that's causing them to feel panicked or overwhelmed or anxious on a chronic basis. For instance, when the brain is in a heightened state of arousal and it's experiencing chronic anxiety or panic, almost always what we're seeing is excessive amounts of fast activity, excessive amounts of beta or high beta activity, where the brain is constantly transmitting a message that doesn't need to be there. The brain is saying, be on alert, be vigilant, when the threat has long since passed. So what we can do in neurofeedback is we can train the brain to stop producing all of that fast activity so that it begins to operate at that slower, more normalized pace, so that the individual no longer feels the panic, no longer feels that physiological anxiety, but they can actually function the way that they want to, knowing that the threat has passed and knowing that it's in the past, and that their brain can operate in a calm and steady state that it's meant to operate for optimal functioning.